Hi, everybody. My name is Dan Fagan. I'm a professor of science journalism at New York University, the director of the Science, Health, and Environmental Reporting Program and the Science Communication Workshops at NYU. And this is another Kavli conversation. We're very grateful to the Kavli Foundation for making this possible. We've been at this for a very long time, and we've been keeping it going during the pandemic. I believe this will be our final Zoom Kavli conversation, and we'll be back to doing these in person as well as live streaming them. I gotta say, we're not gonna miss Zoom, but Zoom has served us well. So thank you, Zoom, and we dearly hope we won't be resorting to you in the future for so many reasons. The ground rules here, always with the Zoom webinar, is please remember that we will use the Q&A box for questions, not the chat box. So if you have questions, and we dearly hope you will, please click on that Q&A little icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen and ask away. And Anna will find a way to work you into the conversation at some point. If she's able. And speaking of Anna, please allow me to have the privilege of introducing Anna Rothschild. She's an award-winning journalist, video producer, presenter, and speaker. She's currently the senior video producer at FiveThirtyEight and the host of FiveThirtyEight's podcast 19, which of course, carrying the dreaded 19 moniker, is about COVID-19. Previously, she was the Washington Post's on-air science reporter. And before that, she hosted, edited, and animated the YouTube series Gross Science for Nova and PBS Digital Studios. And just do yourself a favor and Google Gross Science and Nova sometime, and you'll see the amazing work that she did. Anna studied bio at Brown University, and then she attended SHRP at NYU, where I was lucky enough to have her as one of my students. So we're so grateful to have Kaleigh and Joe here too, and Anna will formally introduce them. So with that, take it away, Anna, and I will depart. So I'll shut off my screen so I don't distract anyone with my, overpowering magnetism. Take it away, Anna.
Thanks so much, Dan. Hi, everyone. I'm really happy to be your moderator tonight. I am super interested in this topic professionally, but also personally. As you may have noticed, I share a last name with a famous banking family that is the subject of many, many conspiracy theories. And even though I'm not related to the famous Rothschilds at all, that doesn't stop people on the internet of accusing me of all sorts of exciting things. So I'm really enthusiastic about and excited to learn, along with all of you in the audience tonight, about why people believe conspiracy theories and how we as journalists should cover them. I don't know, maybe it'll allow me to approach my DMs with a little bit more calm and balance. I'm joined tonight by two absolutely fabulous guests. Joseph Uscinski is a professor of political science at the University of Miami. He studies public opinion and mass media with a particular focus on conspiracy theories. And he's written and edited multiple books on conspiracy theories. He's the co-author of American Conspiracy Theories. And he recently also published a textbook called Conspiracy Theories, a Primer, which doesn't really read like a textbook. It's very conversational. I would highly recommend it. Joe, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thanks for having me.
We are also joined by Kaleigh Rogers. She is my colleague at FiveThirtyEight. She's officially our tech and politics reporter, though she is also an excellent science journalist and has done a ton of reporting on COVID during the pandemic. These days, her beat centers around extremism in all of its forms in America. So she's very well versed in conspiracy theories, and she's thought a lot about how to cover them responsibly as a journalist. Kaleigh, welcome. It is always great to see you.
Yes, thanks for having me, Anna.
So I want to kind of kick this off by getting a bit of a lay of the land. How common is belief in conspiracy theories in America today? Joe, do you want to kick us off?
So, if we define the term conspiracy theorist by anybody who believes at least one conspiracy theory, then everyone falls into that category. And the reason why I say that is because if I do a national poll, the more and more conspiracy theories I put on that poll to ask people if they believe in them, the fewer and fewer people there are that wind up believing in none of them.
Yeah.
And given that there's an infinite number of conspiracy theories out there and multiple permutations of each of those, imagine I put 1,000 or 2,000 conspiracy theories on a poll, which I would never do, but imagine I did that. Everyone's going to believe in at least one, if not several. Mm-hmm. So we all partake a little bit, right? So to me, the distinction isn't between people who believe in conspiracy theories and the rest of us who don't. It's people who really believe a lot, and then people who are more resistant to conspiracy theories. And that's the distinction I think we need to think about more.
Right. I mean, and there's not really a way to quantify that exactly, right? Like that's such a subtle, is there in your field, do you quantify that in some way? Is there like a certain number or way that somebody believes in conspiracy theories that sort of reaches a threshold for you to count them?
Well, because it's a continuum, you're putting it exactly right. It's hard to quantify it. So the best I could say is 1/3 of Americans are the highest third in terms of believing conspiracy theories, right? So, think about it from people who believe very few to people who will believe almost any conspiracy theory. And the further you get away from that extreme, the fewer and fewer. But again, it's not a dichotomy. It's much more of a scale.
Yeah. There's this sense, I think, at least if you read newspapers or if you read sort of popular media, that belief in conspiracy theory is like on the rise in America. Does that really bear out if you look at the data of sort of conspiracy theories and belief over time?
No. And that's one of the big things. So when I first got into the topic, I was reading headlines at the time, and this was 10, 12 years ago, saying, now's the golden age of conspiracy theories. Of course, they say that now, too. Mm-hmm. And I expected then, 2008, 2009, 2010, to be, this is the golden age. And I didn't really find any evidence of that. Polling on, I recently completed a study where I re-polled 50 conspiracy theories that had been polled sometime in the past over the last 60 years and re-polled them the same way and said, have these gone up or down? And the majority either stayed the same or went down. Only a small handful went up. And in terms of just the general worldview towards conspiracy theorizing, I've been polling that for a decade, and that hasn't gone up. And this is the same for some other countries that we have polling data into in Europe, where over time we're not finding increases.
Yeah.
I think maybe what's going on with the media reaction to it that's maybe making it feel that way is the sort of the types of theories that become kind of popular that come and go in waves. And so I'm thinking of like anti-vax, for example. That is one that has the potential to be very disruptive to society, very dangerous to society. So it's going to have more of a news element to it. And that's one that comes and goes. Anna, you yourself have done a lot of reporting on the fact that anti-vax views are not new. It's not something that was invented in the 90s. It's been around as long as there's been vaccines, but there are kind of waves and it ebbs and flows. And I would say that QAnon kind of falls in that camp as well. QAnon is in many ways a recycling of a lot of older conspiracy theories that we've seen before. If you look at the Satanic Panic in the 80s and early 90s, a lot of similarities exist there. And that was another time where there was a lot of media attention on it, kind of on the other side, but a lot of media attention and also a lot of kind of potential to disrupt and cause harm to people. And so when those conspiracy theories are kind of at a slightly more popular in a wave where it's like cresting a little bit, that might attract more media attention than people thinking there's something fishy about JFK's death, for example.
Yeah.
Well, I think there's an important distinction to be made there, because when people ask me this question, I do polling. So I can tell you, okay, this is what the trajectory is when we ask people these things. for journalists, I mean, they're not going to pick their stories based on, oh, I ran a poll yesterday and, I'm going to say it's the golden age now. Or
Well,
something like that.
538 might.
Yeah.
We might.
A little more, but
But what's going on is that journalists have to make decisions about what's sort of impactful and meaningful, regardless of which direction the poll has gone in. And if you have a situation like we've had for the last several years in this country where you have the president of the United States spouting lots and lots of conspiracy theories, it doesn't matter if the poll numbers have gone up. These theories are now more important than they were before. When you have a pandemic, anti-vax becomes more important than it was prior to the pandemic, regardless of the polling data.
for sure.
I was going to actually ask, like, is it very specific to right now that we're seeing more politicians publicly talking about conspiracy theories, or has that happened throughout history too? It just hasn't been as covered or hasn't been as salient for whatever reason.
It's hard to know, because I think what we would have to do is get a lot of rhetoric going way back in the past and then studying it to pick out all the conspiracy theories, which is not as easy as you might think.
Right.
And then see, were they doing it more in the 1830s as opposed to now or something like that? But here's the thing. I mean, think about the question. So are they doing it more than they did during the Red Scare? I don't know, but it sort of puts things in a little bit of perspective, right?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think also whether they're doing it more or less, it kind of doesn't matter. It's sort of like, are they doing it and what kind of impact is it having? And we do know that it's not like this is the first time that politicians in the United States have indulged in conspiracy theories. I mean, going back to, there was a big lie theory around the election of John Quincy Adams. So like, this is as old as America.
Yeah. Kelly Olson in the chat just asked a foundational question that I think is worth answering right now, since it kind of will underpin this entire discussion. She's asking, how do we define conspiracy theory exactly?
Well, that's a good question and one with no good answers. So I have a definition that I use, but just like all words, they don't have inherent meanings, right? Everyone sort of uses the term a different way. And that often becomes a problem because, what you consider to be a conspiracy theory, I might consider to be fact, and vice versa, right? And then another question becomes, well, where do we draw that dividing line between what's conspiracy theory and what's true, right? Because we intend to mean the term conspiracy theory to mean something that doesn't meet some epistemological bar for being true. Yeah. But we all set that differently. And making matters even worse, we set it differently for each idea that we encounter. If someone accuses our group of conspiring, well, the bar for you to convince me that that's true is very high. But if I want to accuse the other party of, oh, well, they're obviously guilty, so the bar is very low because they're a bunch of conspirators, right? So if you were to ask me, quick definition, it's an idea in which a small group of powerful people are working in secret for their own benefit against the common good, and in a way that undermines bedrock ground rules against the widespread use of force and fraud. And further, this idea hasn't been adopted by a majority of relevant experts with open data and evidence that is available for refutation. So sort of a mouthful, but you've got three parts. You got conspiracy theory there, so you have to address the conspiracy part of it and the theory part of it, and also sort of, unlike legal conspiracies, where we're talking about, somebody conspired to knock over the ice cream truck or something. With conspiracy theories, the way we use the term, it's something bigger than that.
Right. It's having an impact on a lot of people. It's not a conspiracy against a single person. Right. You were talking about how it's harder to convince, if you're part of a group, to convince somebody that their group is behind a conspiracy. I'm curious, and Kaleigh, I know you've done some reporting on this. Is belief in conspiracy theory is sort of like evenly distributed across the political divide?
Yeah, I mean, as far as, I feel like Joe would be better to answer this, but I will say that being a member of a particular political party or persuasion doesn't necessarily predispose you to be more likely to believe in a conspiracy theory. And you can easily find conspiracy theories on the left and the right, or people who believe in conspiracy theories on the left and the right.
Yeah,
Joe,
I would
have
agree with
any-
that. And having collected data on this for a long time, both sides believe in different theories, right? So the problem becomes one, a vantage point. If you only look at conspiracy theories the other side believes in, and only those ideas to you are conspiracy theories, then of course the other side is always a bunch of conspiracy theorists,
Mhm.
right? But the data I've collected over a decade says it's largely even. You can run some polls where it's a little more to the left, sometimes a little bit more on the right. And obviously there are different conspiracy theories that are believed more on one side than the other. But overall, I would say if it's not even, it's pretty darn close.
Yeah.
And I think people also have weird kind of assumptions about who believes what conspiracy theory. Like a lot of people assume that everyone who believes in QAnon, for example, is on the right, but that's not true. There are lefty QAnon conspirators, or that most people who are anti-vax are like a crunchy granola, like left-wing hippie person. And that is also not true. There's plenty of right-wing anti-vaxxers as well. So even those assumptions we make about sort of in general, which conspiracy fits into which group might not be what you assume it to be.
Great. Well, let's dive into why people believe conspiracy theories. What are the sort of psychological or sociological conditions that make it more likely that you'll believe conspiracy theories? You've both done a ton of work on this, so I don't know who wants to start.
We might have some disagreements on this, but
Oh, interesting.
From the work that I did a big feature, was it last year that I did that? That might have been 2 years ago now.
No,
anyway,
it was, I'm pretty sure it was last year, but hang on, I have it pulled
what
up.
is time?
Yeah.
Who knows?
Not in a pandemic, who knows? 2021.
But for that piece, I looked at a lot of the existing scientific research where experts were trying to find, are there certain traits or things that align or correlate with a belief in conspiracy theory? And a couple of things have been identified. There's no you can't build one personality profile, like this is the conspiracy theorist. And neither does any single trait mean oh, well, if you have this trait or you're higher in this trait than the average person, you're definitely going to fall for every conspiracy theory. That's just not how humans work. But the reason why I found this research interesting is because these are all traits that we all kind of have to some degree. And I thought that it was useful to remember that people who sort of really deeply, that sort of far end of the spectrum that Joe was referencing, really deeply believe in conspiracy theories or believe in a lot of conspiracy theories, are succumbing to certain quirks of human thinking that we all do to some extent. They're not completely different in every single way from you or I. And so a few of those traits that I outlined in my piece were things like the jumping to conclusions bias. This is a bias where some people, when tested in a way to see how quickly they come to a conclusion after only being given a little bit of information, some people don't need, feel they don't need as much information before coming to a conclusion. Other people like to get as much information as possible before coming to a conclusion. That's a trait that you can measure. Another one, we can maybe share this if people want to
I'm happy. Well, I just shared the link, but I also can do a screen share, Kaleigh, if you want to.
Let's just show the coins real quick and I can
absolutely
walk through that.
Okay. Did that work?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Okay, so look at this little illustration of coins. It's just a series of 10 quarters showing heads or tails. And in the experiment that I was referencing, participants were asked to rate on a scale how random or predetermined they thought that this sequence was, with 1 meaning completely random and 7 meaning completely determined, just looking at the set. And so if you look at this, we've got heads, tails, heads, head, 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 tails, head. And if you take a minute to consider where you would put that on that scale. But the reality is that this was a randomly generated sequence. It's completely random. And if you see a pattern here, cool, that's great. We all can see patterns sometimes. But how sort of strongly they thought that was correlated with how likely they were to believe a conspiracy theory. And so it's this ability to kind of see patterns where there are no patterns. Humans do this kind of naturally anyway. We see, faces in clouds and in the bumpers of cars and things. Like we are pattern seeking animals. But if you have that tendency to a higher degree, you might be more likely to believe in a conspiracy theory. And then just quickly, the other trait that I outlined in the piece, I'm just going to ask like a riddle, basically. So
is this one that you want me to go to, Kaleigh?
I'll just read it out. It's just a question. So if you're running in a race and you pass the person in second place, what place are you in? I don't know if you want to answer, Anna.
Well, I know the answer.
The answer is second place, but you might have said first place because that's kind of the intuitive answer. And so what this is measuring is whether you give the intuitive answer or the analytical answer. People who tend to answer more intuitively are also, correlated with people who believe in conspiracy theories. So there are like little, quirks of thinking that can be correlated with conspiratorial thinking. But as I said, there's no like one single thing that's going to make you, this person's definitely conspiracy theorist because they scored X on this particular measurement.
I'm going to stop screen sharing now, but full disclosure, I did, when I first read your piece, I had to stop myself. I was like, okay, it can't be first. Okay, let me just rethink this for a second. But I will say, if I hadn't been sort of primed for a trap, I might have thought first place.
Honestly, I did. So within that study, there's like a whole series of questions that they used to test this. I just pulled out one, and I did the whole series on like friends of mine at the time. And it was really interesting seeing who was like fully into like every single answer. They just gave the intuitive answer. I was like, ooh, this explains why you talk about astrology so much.
Yeah.
But Joe, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
So I agree with everything you say, and it's all established in the literature that these are factors that are correlated with more beliefs in conspiracy theories. And if you go through all the published studies, there's probably 100, maybe 200 different factors like this now: cognitive, attitudinal, emotional conditions that are all correlated with believing in A or more conspiracy theories. The question we don't have a good answer for yet is, if you put them all together, what ones matter? What matters the most? I mean, to me, it's absolutely true that patternicity and different kinds of intuitive thinking are correlated with conspiracy theory beliefs. The question is why, right? If I see patterns, why does it get me to a conspiracy theory? Why not to God did it, or angels and demons, or my tarot cards were correct, or astrology is absolutely true because of these patterns I'm finding, or karma? It could be anything. It could get you to anything, really, when you think about it. And then the question becomes, well, why do any of these cognitive factors get you to any particular conspiracy theory, right?
Right.
So you can imagine you have pattern seeking people on the left and pattern seeking people on the right, but only one of those groups is going to think Trump is conspiring in one way or the other, right?
Right.
So then you have to tack on, okay, well, now it's going to be mediated by the party they're in and their group attachments and all these other things. So true, these things matter. The question is, what is the connective tissue that's getting someone to conspiratorial explanations, and then what's the tissue that gets them to particular ones? So there have to be other things in there.
Yeah. In the chat, Amanda has a question that I think is a really good one, and also sort of raises another question that I wanted to ask. She says, when it comes to people believing conspiracy theories, is there any element in which they find comfort in the theories, some form of community and or confirmation of their comfort zone in terms of power or privilege?
This is more anecdotal. I know I'm not as well versed on the research in this area, but it's definitely something I've witnessed with certain conspiracy theories. And I've spoken to experts in, new religious movements and cults and things about how those kinds of organizations attract people who are a little bit lost and sort of looking for something. And then this is sort of gives them an answer to that. And I feel like conspiracy theories sometimes can provide that as well. I do suspect that the pandemic and a lot of people being isolated and perhaps out of work and facing new kinds of stressors that we hadn't faced before facilitated at least some people being drawn to QAnon, for example.
Yeah, that was going to be my follow-up about like the effect of sort of like isolation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because I mean, that is in particularly one where there is like a real sense of community and of support for each other online.
That would have been my go-to as well, is QAnon. But QAnon's different than a lot of other conspiracy theories in the sense that they developed a group identity and they referred to themselves as a movement, right? And it was an activity for them in which they were all sort of taking part and feeding off of each other. And that's not the case for a lot of conspiracy theories. It's not like if I was a JFK conspiracy believer, it's not like I'd see somebody else on the street and be like, hey, we're simpatico because of that.
Right.
Or if we're both climate change deniers, somehow we're now friends. And, it doesn't necessarily work that way with most of these things. But so in that sense, QAnon's a little bit of a outlier. And then in the same way, it's also an outlier in that it gave, from what I could tell, it gave the followers hope, which sounds sort of strange because if you're a QAnon believer, you're like, our entire government is controlled by satanic baby-eating cabal and everything's terrible and we're being ruled by very evil people. And it's a very dark outlook. But part of it gave them hope because it's like, oh, well, the Great Awakening's coming and this is all going to be exposed and the bad people are going to be marched off to Guantanamo and summarily hung for their crimes.
Right.
So that made the followers sort of happy, right? There's good things coming, even though there's dark times now. But again, that's a little bit different than a lot of conspiracy theories I see where it's just like, there's dark times now and it's only getting worse.
Yeah. Right.
But that also, even the dark times now, I think what might be comforting is the explanation for it. So there's a reason why all these bad things are happening to you and to people around you. And it's these very clearly evil people that, are just like the worst thing you can imagine. So it's really easy it's like a very black and white. There's bad guys and good guys, and they're doing bad things, which is why bad things happen to you, but good stuff's going to happen and we're going to win. And it reminds me of, I did some reporting around why this was back when I was at Vice, but it was about how after like a mass shooting, often there'll be conspiracy theories that pop up. And I spoke to a researcher at the time, Michael Wood at the University of Winchester, who studies this. And he was talking about how this is a theory, but the theory is basically like the truth, the actual answer that like one person snapped and went and shot up a school and killed a bunch of people is not like that. There's a disconnect between the size of the event and the smallness of the explanation. And to have a conspiracy where there's a bunch of people in on it and there was, crisis actors and it was all a plot to take our guns away, that big explanation fits the bigness of the event. And that's more satisfying and weirdly comforting than the reality, which is just very bleak, that violence happens and sometimes people get shot for no reason. Like that's not a satisfying answer for anybody. And so having this alternative can be weirdly comforting for some people.
Yeah.
I think it's the same thing with elections too.
Mm-hmm.
Anything you win and lose. No loser wants to look in the mirror and say, well, I lost because I wasn't good enough or the other team outplayed me or just got beat. And who wants to do that? Right? It's much easier to say, well, they cheated.
Right.
The refs were bought off. And so after any election, you got about a third of the losing party saying we were cheated.
Right. And it doesn't matter if it's Democrats or Republicans. It's
because it's easier to do that than it is for those people, at least, than to say we were beat fair and square, and this is just how the system works. It's we were cheated, and that can solve your wound, right? It makes you feel better. You know, you'll live again to fight another day, regardless. But it helps you to sort of not deal with the loss.
Yeah, makes sense. There are, of course, tons of conspiracy theories about science, and that's not a new thing since the pandemic, but we have seen so many science-based conspiracy theories since 2020. What is it about science that makes it so ripe for conspiracy theories? Joe, do you want to take this one?
Sure. Well, the answer is I don't think it necessarily is more ripe than anything else. I think we're just paying a lot of attention to the science stuff now.
Okay.
Because there's conspiracy theories about everything, right? Scientific or not very scientific. And, you know, I was thinking before we started the chat, I was thinking through about, you know, what are science conspiracy theories recently? And obviously the vaccine conspiracy theories in the background for the last few decades. We've had GMO conspiracy theories going back some decades, anti-fluoride folks. And then, but depending how you define science, then you have moon landing conspiracy theories too, you know, flat Earth or something like that. I mean, to me, the answer to the question is people conspiracy theorize about everything. There are a few topics that don't have conspiracy theories about them. And anyway, because conspiracy theories address power, it's often going to come down to someone's going to conspiracy theorize about something when they don't like the powerful person who they think is behind it. So if you're somebody who's like, I don't like those pharmaceutical companies, they're all corrupt and they're doing all these terrible things, then obviously any sort of vaccine or medicine they make to you is probably part of some conspiracy theory.
Right.
So.
I do wonder too if a lack of science literacy contributes to the popularity of some of these theories, and just the nature of science, that it is something that is constantly evolving and changing. You know, it's not a fixed, finished thing. And especially with the pandemic, you know, there was a lot of confusion and anxiety about our understanding evolving, you know, over masks, for example. Our understanding of masks has evolved multiple times as we've done more research and you know, taken the time to really consider what's going on. And a lot of people see that and they're like, how can science change? Science doesn't just change. I'm like, actually, science always changes. That's the whole point of science.
Yeah.
But yeah, so then there's this, and it's gotten weirdly wrapped up in a lot of politics where people are kind of like dogmatic about like, I trust the science, or like, I do my own research. And there's just sort of this weird dichotomy there that I think has made those kinds of theories a little more salient. But at the same time, to Joe's point, you know, there's certain institutions that attract conspiracy theories, the government and pharmaceutical companies, and kind of for good reason. They don't have a great track record. You know, pharmaceutical companies lied to us about opioids and about how addictive they were. They knew what was going on. They just lied about it for a long time until they were caught. You know, the government has lied and covered up all kinds of conspiracy theories. So it's not insane. It's not coming from nowhere to sort of target those kinds of institutions and be a little skeptical of them.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to ask, like, how, particularly as journalists, do we kind of cover skepticism, like when there's an outpouring of skepticism or dissent about an issue? How do we cover that responsibly without then sort of just shutting down the other side, which I feel like is part of how conspiracy theories kind of grow? Maybe I'm making this up, but like I think about like I think Michael Balter asked about the lab leak hypothesis in the chat. You know, that's become so politicized and like a really hot topic. And I think part of it is because people asking legitimate questions felt very shut down, which then kind of caused there to be like a sense that there were people in power who were shutting down people who weren't in power. I'm speaking about something that I probably should just be leaving to you two to talk about. But I mean, how as journalists do we cover topics responsibly without sort of shutting down the other side? And then I want to actually ask Michael's question after that. But Kaleigh, do you want to take that?
Yeah, I think about this a lot. I have a lot of thoughts about this. I'll try to summarize it quickly. The one thing that needs to be important is whatever you're covering rises to the level of being worth covering. So I see sometimes stories about, for example, like, oh, QAnon believes X, and it's like 2 posts in a Telegram group of some theory that was floated. And it, like, to me, that doesn't rise to the level of impact that it needs to be covered. And it's just shining a bigger light on a small fringe group of people who believe something. So it needs to raise the level where either an elected official is talking about this or contributing to this in some way, or people are acting in a certain way, or in the rare case where this might be the fact that a big enough group of people are believing something that it's worth covering. The other part, I do think that, I don't know, there's, as you said, like, not dismissing and being considerate of what people are bringing to you and what people are believing and where that's coming from. I think that with the big lie, for example, a lot of people who believe, even calling it the big lie is probably problematic, to be honest, but a lot of people who believe that there were problems with the 2020 election feel almost gaslit by the media when we write a sentence that says something like, and there's no evidence of this, because to them, they've seen mountains of evidence. And why aren't you looking at that evidence? And that evidence has been debunked. But rather than addressing that in the story and saying, like, well, here's several pieces of supposed evidence that was considered but has been debunked, just saying there is no evidence feels like you're lying or you're covering something up. And then that just further erodes trust. And there is, I think we have to admit, often a sort of bias in the types and sort of ways that we cover conspiracy theories. I mean, the way that the Russia collusion story was covered compared to, Hunter Biden's laptop, those were 2 stories that had kind of, at the beginning, kind of the same amount of evidence and were sort of question marks and got very different treatment in the media. I think we need to be really careful about that, because we already, as journalists, have lost a lot of trust. And to build that back, we have to be really thoughtful about what we're challenging and how we're challenging it, and considering where people are coming from with these points of view. I mentioned to you before too, like with ivermectin, for example, There was a lot of people that felt very passionately that ivermectin was this miracle cure that was being hidden from us. And at that time, I wrote about this a little bit, but at that time we didn't know. So it was, I kind of got the sense that it was being dismissed as like, well, it's definitely nothing. It doesn't work at all. These people are crazy. And I looked at the science and we genuinely didn't know yet. It was being studied.
Right.
And so this dismissiveness, I think, doesn't do us any favors as journalists, because we're just further eroding that trust.
Yeah.
Kind of rambled there for a minute, but those are some
I
of the
thought that
things
was-
I think and worry about.
Yeah. Joe, you're not a journalist, but I mean, but you do study media. Like, when you see how journalists have written about the pandemic, for example, do you see ways in which we've fallen into traps of sort of like breeding conspiracy theories in how we've covered some of these issues?
Yeah, and I think it's really important to think through these issues, because I'll put numbers on this. So I used to get a handful of calls a year as a professor. And then I think, starting in 2015, it was 50 to 100 calls from journalists a year. In 2020, I took 300 calls from journalists. Part of the reason for this is that major news organizations all have teams of reporters dedicated to social media misinformation, conspiracy theories, disinformation. They're all on that beat. And I think in having these conversations, one thing that worries me is that once you tie people's jobs to this topic being consequential and important, all of a sudden it's consequential and important,
That's interesting.
even when it may not be, right? So somebody asked me the other day, because I sort of downplay a lot of the effects of conspiracy theories and know they're not going up. It doesn't mean they're not important. It doesn't mean they don't have effects. It's just compared to some of my colleagues, I'm a little more relaxed in terms of what how I rate now to the past and what how bad the consequences are and whatnot. They say, well, how can you have that attitude? And I say, well, I'm tenured. I said, I don't have to make the case that my topic is the most important thing in the world right now, right? I want to make sure that I'm making clear it's appropriate. I want to say it's the appropriate amount of important, right? So there are probably things far more important than conspiracy theories right now, and I have no trouble saying that. And I think I've said from the beginning of my research into this that there could be a ton of consequences coming from conspiracy theories, or maybe conspiracy theories are just rationalizations given by people who would have acted deleteriously anyway. We don't fully have that worked out.
Right. It's not clear what's the kind of cause and what's the effect. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think this is an important conversation to have simply for that reason, that we got a lot of people paying attention. And if everyone's saying, the consequences are dire and it's the worst thing ever, then that's what we're going to be telling people, but it's not necessarily the case. So we want to be very, very careful with that. But I mean, I guess if I was to just give a very quick list of things that have occurred to me in the conversation I've had with journalists, it's don't find every weird conspiracy on the corner of the internet and do a story on it. I think you mentioned that, but I get a lot of calls that do exactly this. And it's like, why do we care? Don't assume that just because something's on the internet, everyone's going to see it and everyone's going to believe it. There's a lot of stuff on the internet. No one's ever looking. And even if they did, they wouldn't be convinced. And be careful with our causal claims. Just because somebody has a belief doesn't mean they'll act on it. And just because someone does act and they have a belief doesn't mean the belief made them do it.
Right.
Right? I mean, take anti-vax. I mean, there's a big correlation between people who believe anti-vax conspiracy theories and people who don't get vaccinated. But a lot of the factors that drive them to have those beliefs also drive them to not want to get vaccinated. So the relationship between the conspiracy theory and the behavior might not really be there. It might be illusory.
That's interesting.
Right.
I never would have thought about it that way. That is actually really interesting.
So I'll give you one quick example outside of that. I mean, there was a very unfortunate, horrible case not too long ago where a guy took his kids to the border of Mexico and stabbed them to death with a sword.
Oh God. Yeah.
And some of the reports came out, he was a QAnon believer. He believed conspiracy theories, and these theories got him to kill, murderous children. And once you start looking through what people are saying about him, what his dialogue was prior to this incident, you start to see that the person's probably unwell. And there's a whole lot of factors besides conspiracy theories that are driving this. And to pin it on one belief that he happened to be exposed to online sort of shrinks this entire person just to one thing, where in fact he had a lot of things going on, a lot of personality traits and a lot of issues. And we're putting a lot of causation onto something where it may not belong.
Right. And as you both talked about, it's not that it's, anyone can believe a conspiracy theory. It's not that you have to be mentally ill to believe a conspiracy theory, but this person may have had other things going on that let him both believe conspiracy theories and also do this horrific thing.
Yeah, I mean, in this case, he thought he was Neo from the Matrix, and that his wife had serpent DNA and da 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 da. Now, once you see that, you go, okay, well, it's probably not just a conspiracy theory.
Right. I know Dan wants to hop in with a question.
Oh, yeah, if it's okay. I am finding this really interesting. One thing we haven't talked about yet, or we did only briefly, are these secondary effects that, when we cover conspiracy theories, there's the worry about breeding more conspiracy theorists. but there are also these political effects. Then you get Republicans, or whoever coming in and justifying voter suppression by saying, well, many people believe this is a problem, so we need to do something about this. and so that, is a whole nother, maybe even more corrosive. You have Supreme Court justices being asked about child pornography simply because a portion of their base is convinced that child pornography is endemic and that liberals are all child molesters. So there are all these ripple effects that potentially are even more dangerous. And I don't know what the answer is, but I guess I'm really interested in your all's thoughts on that. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that Joe and I would probably agree on is having a better grasp of the numbers. So understanding what the polling actually shows as far as belief in something. Like there's a lot of, one of the stories I think I spoke with you about was about how like kind of challenging it is to actually gauge belief in QAnon and polling, and B, that what we do see tends to be pretty static and low, that the vast majority of Americans don't follow or believe in QAnon. And yet it attracts all this attention. I think sometimes rightfully, if it's, rising to a certain occasion, like January 6th, and, some of the connections there, I think were worth pointing out. But again, the sort of every other day story where like QAnon believers think this, like, I just don't see the value in that. And it just sort of, it makes, I think, readers and our audiences think that this is a much bigger group and movement than it really is.
My answer would be we need to get better political leaders. And because a lot of what your question comes down to is why is people on the Senate doing this in a Judiciary Committee? Well, they shouldn't be. And what they're engaging in was nonsense, and shame on them. But they'll all get reelected, right? Why did the Republican Party let someone with no governing experience, who's barely a Republican or a conservative, run under the banner for president in 2016? Don't know. Why did Democrats let Marianne Williamson on the stage in 2020 to debate talking about cosmic dark forces? I think that there's a role for the parties here to block people from you running under their banner. And if they did that, of course, there'd be some backlash, but it would be for the better, for the common good.
I guess the issue, Joe, sorry to interrupt you, is that it's the parties themselves, at least one party, that is finding it quite politically advantageous to monopolize on people's to capitalize on people's mistaken beliefs. So all the incentives, at least in that part of the political spectrum, seem to be not to repudiate, but to reinforce and encourage these counterfactual beliefs.
I think both parties do that to some degree. I think right now the Republican Party is doing it in a way that's incredibly odious and dangerous. But here's the thing you brought up the voter fraud beliefs. Well, Republican leaders are doing things Republican leaders wanted to do anyway, and they're justifying it with these conspiracy theories. But they are incentivized to try to keep the other side from voting against them, so that's why they're putting in these voter laws. So do we blame the conspiracy theory, or do we blame political self-interest in that case? I mean, it's just brazen political self-interest, and they're using the conspiracy theory to manipulate their people. But to take the pedophilia stuff too, I mean, unfortunately, there is child sex trafficking and child pornography and these things in the country, but people tend to vastly overestimate its size. Right, the scope of the problem. So any amount more than zero is repugnant, and it should be zero. But I poll on this, and I'll give you one quick example. So we asked people, some groups claim that there's currently 300,000 children currently being sex trafficked in the country. Do you think the number is more than this, about this, or less than this? Vast majority of Americans said it was 300,000 or more, with many saying it was much more. Now, that number was fact-checked by the Washington Post as being a handful of Pinocchios. We don't know the exact number, but it's nowhere near 300,000 in the US, right? So what does that tell you? There's a market for people who want to come out and say, save the children, because people vastly overestimate the number of children who need to be saved. They overestimate the size and scope of this problem. And everybody's against pedophilia, and everybody's against child sex trafficking, and everyone wants to save the children. So when a politician comes out and beats their chest, says, I'm going to save the children from these, groomers, or whatever they're calling them now, that's cheap, easy political points, right? And who do I blame for it? Well, the elites, like on the Senate Judiciary Committee, that were engaging in this, but also there's a lot of other blame to go around, because there's people in Congress, people at lower levels of government, local sheriffs, like some of the ones here in Florida, who are always saying, we're making the biggest child sex trafficking sting ever. And then you come out the next day, how many people will be charged with sex trafficking? 0. We only busted adult Johns. But the headlines say massive child sex trafficking sting. So there is a lot of baloney out there on this, and politicians are happy to take advantage of it.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
I'm gonna turn my screen off again, but I'm listening to every word.
Yeah,
and slinks back into the ether.
that rhetoric is particularly frustrating because it's also politically very hard to counter. Nobody wants to be the politician that's like, well, actually, like there's like, it's not as big a problem as you're saying, or like, I don't, no one wants to go against the person saying save the children. Like you can't you can't respond to that. No one's saying don't save the children. So it's kind of, it's a bit Teflon, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Right. I want to pivot a little bit. A lot of conspiracy theories have sort of a nugget of truth, or at least historically have a nugget of truth. Lyric asked a really good question in the chat. She said, I've noticed a lot of people in my fellow minority communities believing in government conspiracies to eradicate them and their populations. For example, Indigenous and Black Americans. With evidence of this in the past, how do you navigate the conversation? And I mean, this is certainly true for race, but it's true about like pretty much every conspiracy theory has some nugget of truth to it. Or I don't want to say everyone, but like many of them do. So as a reporter, how do you sort of navigate that? And how do you suss out what's like, how do you provide any sort of sense of how do you instill trust in a conversation when many of these institutions have let people down?
Yeah.
Whether it's the government or a company or whatever.
Yeah, it's challenging. I think part of it is acknowledging that history. And like I said, like, validating that your reason for coming to this conclusion is real and makes sense and is logical in many ways. I think that can be helpful. And then the other aspect of it is sort of like understanding how those conspiracies, which they were, came to light eventually, and what led to that. So, something like Watergate, like there was whistleblowers, like there was eventually like things come to light. It's hard to keep, especially the sort of conspiracy theories that we're talking about here are massive, coordinated, thousands of people involved kinds of ideas. That's something that's very difficult to keep secret forever, with nobody finding out, no leaks, no whistleblowing, no evidence of it actually existing. That's a lot harder to keep under wraps. And historically, those things have come to light, which is how we know about them. And, I would say historically, journalists have played a role in bringing those things to light. And so hopefully, trusting that that's sort of what we want to do. I think a lot about how if there genuinely was fraud in an American presidential election, I would absolutely want to hear about it. Like, I would absolutely want to see, that's Pulitzer Prize winning territory there. Like, if you were to break that story and prove that with real evidence. And so this idea that, like, this conspiracy people have, the journalists are like covering stuff up or like in on it. Like that's just the opposite of what we're here to do.
Yeah. I mean, do you think the term conspiracy theory gets thrown around too much? Because like certainly like if you look at like Watergate, for example, or even like even JFK's murder, like there are a bunch of people who are skeptical and are in the Watergate situation, like who we now call whistleblowers, who helped, bring something to light, but it also took like people believing them to get that story to come to light. And in the case of JFK being killed, I don't know that we would have so much information about JFK's murder if there weren't a bunch of people who thought it was a conspiracy and then like forced government officials or the media to cover this topic. And I mean, as a result, we now know that like there isn't very much evidence, but still, there's a sort of role for it.
That's sort of what I was getting at with like also like validating where people are coming from and like looking at what they're showing you and taking it seriously to a certain extent. So like I've in covering the big lie, there was in Michigan, there was 170 or something sworn affidavits from people in election counting rooms and election observers saying they saw, fishy stuff. And a bunch of people were citing that. And I read the affidavits, I didn't just dismiss it and be like, well, this is obviously bogus because my predisposition, I said, okay, well, what did they say? Let's look at it. Is there anything to this? And I think giving it, your due diligence as a reporter can never hurts. It's, I'm not going to spend a lot of time checking out if, the government is run by lizard people, but for something that's maybe newer or that we don't know as much about, I'm going to look a little, ivermectin, things like that. I'm going to take my time to actually report.
Yeah. Joe, do you think that we overuse the term conspiracy theory or conspiracy theorist?
I think it's both. I think we use it too much and not enough. And I think the problem is that people are very selective with what they call conspiracy theory and what they don't. And that's where I opened up the session earlier saying something to that effect, is that, the things we believe are conspiracy facts, the things he believes are conspiracy theories, right? But the epistemological bar, who knows, right?
Yeah.
Because oftentimes this is the issue, is that people come to the belief first. The evidence comes second, if at all, right? So if you want to argue evidence or logic or reason with somebody who's got a belief, it may not have been evidence, logic, and reason that got them there in the first place. It's something else. It's they're taking a cue from a trusted leader, politician, a news source they trust, a friend, or they're believing this because it meshes with what they already believe about the world. That conspiracies happen, and they're happening from this other competing group against the group I belong to. Right? So when we argue evidence, often it doesn't get us that far. And even if it does, we're sort of playing whack-a-mole. Because like, oh, I debunked your one conspiracy theory and you changed your mind on it. Only 800 more to go, So it doesn't necessarily do it. And just on the point of evidence, I mean, conspiracies do happen. I'm convinced that there are powerful people conspiring against us as we speak. But which people doing what? I don't know. Right. So that can be true, but that doesn't mean anyone's given pet conspiracy theory is true, right? And every idea has evidence, right? The guy who pushes the lizard people idea has written 10 books, all 400 or 500 pages each, with all his evidence about the lizard people. Does it convince me? No. Right. And it's just sort of evidence is in the eye of the beholder.
Right.
No.
I think a lot of sometimes when I talk about this topic with just like friends and family, people have this idea of like a conspiracy theorist being this like person with like the map with red string and like a tinfoil hat. And they think of themselves as like, a logical human being that would never believe that. But, all I have to do is name like 2 or 3 conspiracy theories that are I'm like, if someone says they don't believe in conspiracy theories, I just say Jeffrey Epstein, and they're like, well, I do have a lot of questions about that. It's not that hard you don't have to dig that deep to find that most people have some kind of conspiracy theory that they're at least have questions about.
Right.
I think there's an important point too. I mean, we're just focusing on conspiracy theories here, but there are a lot of questionable ideas out there, and the world is littered with them.
Yeah.
And they're all over mainstream media, right? Conspiracy theory or other things, right? So, I mean, what was the biggest show ever on Animal Planet? It was the mermaid, the body found, about the Navy conspiracy to kill mermaids,
Oh my gosh.
right? What's their other big show? Finding Bigfoot. Guess what? They haven't found him yet. History Channel. I thought it was history. What was I watching today? Nostradamus predicts asteroid's going to hit you soon. Or did Nostradamus predict the 2016 election? Or ancient aliens built the pyramids? And flip through your other cable channels, and you've got Paranormal Hunter, Paranormal Finder, Ghosts. I think there's something coming up on a channel that says a string of murders out west are due to hibernating vampires who wake up every few years and then eat people and then
Oh my gosh.
disappear. So there's nonsense everywhere. It's baked into the cake of humanity. And just acting like, oh, this only started when Trump showed up, or because it's now the post-truth era, it's sort of ridiculous. I mean, there are so many nonsense things out there, whether it's horoscopes, astrology, you can keep going down a list of weird beliefs that people have. And people believe a lot of stuff that doesn't have good evidence. Right.
Yeah. Even less like woo-woo than that. Like, well, I guess this is woo-woo, but less supernatural, I guess. Like the homeopathy market is huge in the United States. Homeopathy is based on the theory that the more you dilute something, the more potent it gets, which defies logic. And it's a huge industry. A lot of people take homeopathic remedies for everything under the sun. So
Right.
Yeah, and on my polls, like we get concerned about, oh my God, the president said, you could spray yourself with Lysol and prevent COVID or something. And we get, 12% agreeing with that. But we get a lot more, 20% or so, saying you could get right with God and that will prevent your COVID, or you can pray it away. Or if you want to do that, go ahead, but you're better off wearing a mask and getting vaccinated. So,
But I mean, if somebody holds that belief very strongly, I mean, this is a big philosophical question as a journalist. I mean, is there a way to convince them? And then as a journalist, like, should you be trying to, if that's like a very deeply held belief, like who is the target audience when we report on this stuff?
Right.
To who are we trying to influence, or who are we trying to inform? Influence is maybe the wrong word, but who are we really trying to inform?
Yeah, I don't see it as my job to try to change anybody's mind on anything. And I don't suspect that someone who has a deeply held belief, conspiratorial or not, is going to be convinced by one news article. I do see it as my job to report facts, to inform people to the best of my knowledge of what's going on and what the experts have to say and what the data shows and what the polling shows, and bring that together in a way that is understandable. And I think maybe the best case scenario is that provide, using ivermectin again as an example. If I write about that and say, here's what we do know, here's what we don't know, here are some, other treatments that we do, there's great evidence show that they work. And maybe the family member of someone who's on life support and demanding ivermectin and nothing else is better equipped and has a little more knowledge when they go and talk to their loved one in the hospital, things like that. I think the more informed and well-informed and properly informed electorate is much better than a misinformed and confused and conspiratorial electorate.
Yeah.
Well, I think to that point, and you brought this up earlier, it's good. How should you cover something like ivermectin when it pops up in discussion? And I think the real question is, who has the burden of proof, right? someone says ivermectin works and we should be doing something with it, the burden of proof's on them to show positive proof that it actually works and to provide studies that it happens, not for anyone to have to say, no, there's a non-effect or that doesn't work. Right. So I'm not suggesting that journalists should argue, no, ivermectin doesn't work until it's proven that it does. It's, if you want to claim it does, you have to prove it. Right. So that's a different thing. But onto this current discussion, who can we convince is an empirical question. Some people.
Yeah.
But let me put it in other terms. Can you put a Democrat and a Republican in a closet for 10 minutes and have them convince each other to join the other party? No. Catholic and a Jew, are they going to change each other's minds? No, not with a conversation or a link or anything like that. So who can you convince? People who aren't sure, maybe on the bubble, and someone who might have seen an idea in passing makes a little bit of sense, but if you get them with evidence quickly in a good argument, and you can potentially convince them if they're open to it. Mm-hmm. But for most people, if their heels are dug in, no way. Now there's a normative question too, because a lot of people in my line of work are engaged in how can we change people's minds about their cherished beliefs? What can we do? Now the news is that there is no great way to do that, but there's an ethical question here. Should we have that power? Should anyone have that power? Because if you can use that tool to get somebody to not believe a conspiracy theory, to believe something that's true, it can also be used to not believe the truth and believe whatever else you want them to believe, conspiracy theory or not. So we have to be very careful with those sorts of things. And people often get upset when they talk about, well, these people don't change their minds. There's no evidence that can change their mind. Well, sometimes that's a good trait of humanity, that we're not all just lemmings wandering around getting convinced of every new data point that we run into, right? So we have to think hard about these questions, because any method developed to change minds can be used by good people for good purposes or bad people for really bad purposes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the other experts I spoke to, I think for my interactive story, but was talking about that thing that like humans' ability to hold fixed beliefs is like evolutionarily helpful. Every time the sun sets, we don't think like, oh no, the sun is no longer in the sky, it doesn't exist anymore.
Right.
Like we're able to continue to hold those beliefs. That's generally a good thing. And that's sort of why we are sometimes stubborn in our beliefs.
Yeah. There was a fun question in the chat, just for a little levity. Do you consider the birds aren't real movement to be a conspiracy theory? And do you think a parody social movement with a purpose, as the movement is described in the Times, can bring light to misinformation by poking fun at it?
Well, the idea itself is a conspiracy theory, right? If the idea is that birds are fake and they're actually government robots recording us or something, I mean, clearly a conspiracy theory. But a lot of the people engaging with it don't actually believe that that's true. They're engaging with it, as a parody to make fun of people who believe similar ideas. So
right. Yeah. But as this person wrote, you have to be in on the joke a little bit.
Yeah.
Well, there could be people who believe that it's real, and I don't doubt that. So
it feels it's like high internet to me. That whole movement was just very trolly. And like, yeah, I guess is some levity to it, but I don't know, maybe I take this stuff too seriously. I'm like, someone's going to just think that this is real and either write a dumb story about it thinking people really think this, or really think it and believe it themselves.
Yeah. Eleanor has a question about how social media influences conspiracy theories. I guess I'm curious, like, what has changed about how we how many conspiracy theories we see because of the social media age? And do we see any sort of like difference in whether people are more prone to believe them or not?
So in terms of individual conspiracy theories. I don't find any evidence that beliefs in individual theories have increased in the internet era.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll just give you the critical case would be COVID, right? Everybody's locked inside under the most terrible conditions in a pandemic. Everyone's spending more time online, and there's plenty of misinformation and conspiracy theories out there. These beliefs, if anything, should have gone through the roof, right? Like if I was this mad scientist and I wanted to put a bunch of people in a laboratory, I would have done COVID-19 pandemic because you're cranking every knob to 11. Oh,
Mhm.
anxiety, stress, economic destruction, deadly pandemic. Everyone's going to become a conspiracy theorist. We're repeatedly polled on the same things over and over again throughout the pandemic. No increases. Either people believed it or they didn't. Right, and that was the same with everything that we polled on, both conspiracy theories and different pieces of misinformation. Stability was the norm. So when they were taking down the pandemic video and saying, "Oh, this is going to spread all these ideas everywhere," we had polled before it came out, we polled after, and didn't find any differences. So I don't want to say that the internet does nothing, but oftentimes what the question is well, people have this negative view of the internet where it's, oh, I'm going to social media to get my dose of conspiracy theories today. And that's just, it's not all conspiracy theories on social media and the internet, just like it's not all politics, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's just not the case, to me anyway, that there's been some massive change in conspiracy theorizing because of social media. The change to me is that we can see these conversations that would have just floated away with the wind at the water cooler decades ago. But now they're there for anyone to see and say, aha, there it is.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean it wasn't there before in some other form.
Yeah. It's just easier for other people to bump into it in some way.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I mean, the methods of communicating theories and their supposed evidence is different. Instead of self-publishing a book or like printing out a black and white pamphlet with all the information about the lizard people, you can start a web page and have a blog post that looks like a news article that has all these information and fake quotes from people, and that can get shared. As Joe pointed out, that doesn't mean that it's more prevalent or more convincing. It's just sort of a different method.
Right.
That things are getting, like everything else that the internet changed. It's
I mean,
different way of doing it.
I mean, one example I go to is the JFK because it was polled so much.
Mhm.
But only a few weeks after the assassination, belief that it was a conspiracy rather than a lone gunman was at 50% in December of 1963.
Yeah.
By the mid 70s, it was 80% of Americans. And that's only come down in the internet era. So what does that tell us? So you don't need the internet for these beliefs to get really high. And JFK, those numbers for JFK in the 70s are higher than anything I've polled on in the last decade.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So it's just not the case that everyone's believing everything now, even though everyone believes that everyone's believing everything now.
Yeah. Okay, I think we have time for one more question. And I said I was going to ask Michael's question from earlier, and I totally blew past it. So Michael Balter's question is conspiracy theory an appropriate term to describe the lab leak hypothesis for the origins of COVID-19? This is a bit of a subjective question, I guess, but I am curious to hear both of your opinions on it.
It depends what you're alleging in your hypothesis. If you say this disease accidentally leaked from a lab, you're not alleging a conspiracy. You're just saying something might have happened, and hopefully they'll investigate and find out what really happened. If you're alleging that there's a cover-up by some government to hide the truth about it, or it was developed purposely as a bioweapon to be deployed or something like that, then you probably are engaging in conspiracy theory. But I'm not passing judgment on it, because to me,
it may be true. You don't know.
It may be true. It could be a conspiracy theory and be true. It hasn't risen to the level to convince me yet.
Right.
But it could still be true. So
yeah, that makes sense. I mean, for the record, I wasn't saying that it was necessarily true. I was just saying just because something is called a conspiracy theory by the definition you've given doesn't necessarily mean that it's fake.
Like Woodward and Bernstein were hunting down a conspiracy theory.
Exactly.
But we don't call it a conspiracy theory anymore because it's reached
it's been
a certain level.
Proven. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But this is a problem with the language, you know, that the conspiracy theory now, it's a regular talking point, a way to dismiss. Say, well, that's the conspiracy theory, as in you must be crazy to believe in that. But you guys, I think, quite properly are adopting a more literal definition, which is belief in a conspiracy that, you know, is probably less likely to be true than not. Sorry, more likely to be false than true, but could be true. And so for journalists, you know, that's a real dilemma. I mean, how do you decide, Kaleigh, you know, what do we do under those circumstances? And do we use the term conspiracy theory if it is often heard as that's crazy, there's no way that's true?
Right. Yeah. I think I'm pretty conservative in how often I actually call something a conspiracy theory in my work. And yeah, and I think having that, being careful about when something rises to the level of being actually newsworthy helps with some of that, because you don't need to report on every single conspiracy theory that exists, because there are a lot of them.
Yeah. Well, I felt like this was a fantastic session. Very grateful to you guys, and I feel something I did not think would be possible, and that is I feel sort of a little less bleak about this than I did 90 minutes ago or 75 minutes ago, and that's not what I expected, but it's interesting and kind of empowering too.
Yeah, I feel more compassion also. I mean, everyone can believe a conspiracy theory, and I think it makes me feel a little bit more compassionate towards people who hold different beliefs than I do.
Yeah, which is not to say that it's not terribly corrosive. You know, the effects of some of these beliefs, you know, are truly terrible for our public life and media and media credibility and you know, positive political action. All those things are true, but the believers themselves, they're us, maybe just us, you know, to the third power, but they're us.
Yeah.
I don't know. Do you guys? Is that right, Joe?
Well, I don't want to ruin your buzz. So hopefully you still feel less bleak after I say this. But I think there's good news and bad news. And the good news is things aren't getting worse in terms of the public's beliefs in conspiracy theories. The bad news is that these were always there. And this is a very human problem, and it's very it's part of the human experience. And we should feel compassion because it's part of who we are. And if we want to blame some exogenous force, oh, it's Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook, it's social media. I mean, that's easy to do, but it's almost like it's doing what we accuse conspiracy theorists of, right?
Yeah.
Blaming some other thing. It's not easy to say, you know, we're people and we're prone to believing a lot of things that aren't very true, and maybe we ought to each work on that.
Yeah. I think that's a really nice note to end on, actually. I don't feel any less optimistic or positive.
It's less, I still feel less bleak.
Yeah.
Slightly less bleak. Yeah, maybe a little bit less bleak, but still less bleak. Thank you all so much. Very grateful to Joe and Kaleigh, and of course to Anna for making this possible. And thank you to those of you who listened and asked such great questions. This will be available online at journalism.nyu.edu/KC for Kavli conversations. And it should be available for viewing tomorrow, maybe the day after tomorrow. And you'll also see it on YouTube. And by the way, our next Kavli conversation will be May 3rd. We hope live from Caveat in New York City. And we're not positive about the topic, but we think it may well be about how far should drug legalization go. And there are some really interesting social and political implications of that discussion, as it was also true of today's discussion. So thank you all very much. I'm going to shut off the recording now, and we'll see you on May the 3rd.
Great. Thanks, everyone.